Rome wasn't built in a day, and it didn't fall in a day either. Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of Drunk History with Graf. This is a series in which I drink some alcohol and talk about history, starting from the Bronze Age going all the way up to present day. Last episode we discussed the conquests of Alexander and the split of his empire between his generals. In this episode, we're going to completely ignore all of that and we're going to go and skip over to Italy to go and talk about the birth of Rome. In this episode, I hope to cover the birth of Rome, its starting myths, and also a couple of other things that I didn't get to talk about last time. Now, last episode we left off at the start of the Hellenistic period in Greece and the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, I didn't really talk a whole lot about that because most of what goes on there is really of fairly little consequence, and you'll find out why a little later. But I think we may as well go over a brief overview of the Hellenistic kingdoms. So, first of all, we have Macedon here, which remains as a relatively stable and fairly powerful Greek kingdom. Next to it is the kingdom of Epirus, which will become important later in this episode, hopefully. There really isn't a whole lot to say about Macedon. It doesn't really do much at this point. The real big important things going on are outside of mainland Greece. In the place of the Achaemenid Empire of Persia, there was now the Seleucid or Seleucid Empire, which was essentially the same thing, except now it was ruled by a Greek warrior class initially under the general Seleucus. The Seleucid Empire spends most of its time warring against Egypt and against the neighbouring kingdoms that broke off from it. Speaking of those kingdoms, most of these were off in the east. See, when Alexander had conquered the Persian Empire, the Persian Emperor had fled into Bactria and into Parthia and Sogdia, which is this sort of area up here, sort of where Afghanistan is in modern day, and Alexander chased him there. And so that resulted in him conquering these areas as well. But when Alexander died and Seleucus took over that part of the empire, they declared independence. And this resulted in the creation of what's been dubbed by historians the Greco-Bactrian state, which is much like the Seleucid Empire. It's a mostly local native state, but it's ruled by a Greek ruling class. The Greco-Bactrian state would spend most of its time fighting against the Seleucids, trying to maintain their independence, but also they did a fair bit of conquering to the south into India as well. Then we have Ptolemaic Egypt. Now this is a massive dumpster fire. See, after the end of Alexander's empire, a general called Ptolemy declared himself to be the pharaoh of Egypt by the will of Alexander. As you might have recalled from last episode, Alexander did not have a will beyond to the strongest, which didn't mean anything. But the Egyptian people didn't know that, so onwards with the Ptolemaic dynasty. With Egyptian pharaohs, it was fairly common for an Egyptian pharaoh to marry their sister or their half-sister. In fact, if I remember correctly, the famous pharaoh Tutankhamun also ended up marrying his half-sister. When the Ptolemies took control of Egypt, they took this custom and they began to commit what us historians like to refer to as Hapsburgery. And for those of you who are not aware of what Hapsburgery is, it is when a ruling royal family practices incestuous marriages on a mass scale to keep the bloodline pure and to not let any other people outside of the family from getting any claim to the legitimacy of the state. Quite honestly, how the Ptolemy dynasty managed to stay in power for as long as it did is beyond me, because almost all of them married their sisters, and that made them very inbred. Out of all of the Hellenistic kingdoms, Ptolemaic Egypt would actually last the longest, with its final ruler being Cleopatra VII. And this is why the Egyptian pharaoh Cleopatra had a name that was common in Greece, because the ruling class was Greek. And funny bit of trivia, almost every single member of the Ptolemy dynasty was either named Ptolemy or Cleopatra. Every single one. Right, now that we've dealt with that, let's head on over to Italy and get started with the main meat of what's supposed to be in this episode, Rome. Now, the origins of Rome are shrouded in mystery, because there's not a whole lot of documentation. But What we do have is an oral tale which has been passed down through generations of Romans that explains the birth of the Roman state. Now, for this, I'm going to bring up something here. This is the mythology warning alarm. Now, I'm going to bring this up every single time that I have to talk about folk history or mythology in this series, because there are a lot of parts of history that simply do not have documentation, but they need to be explained somehow, so the people at the time came up with a story, essentially. And that's what happened with Rome. So, whenever you see this popping up, that means that what I'm talking about is quite possibly unreliable at best, downright fiction at worst. So do keep this in mind. Now, the story of Rome begins in a epic poem that was written centuries afterwards called the Aeneid, written by Virgil. And what the Aeneid essentially is it's a rip-off of the Odyssey and the Iliad. That's what it's meant to be, particularly the Odyssey. But it's also meant to, as I've said, provide a foundation myth for Rome. So this story starts in Troy, with a Trojan called Aeneas. And as Troy is destroyed, Aeneas gathers a bunch of refugees and sets sail on a ship, where he's going to go and found a new city. They sail around the Mediterranean for a very long time. Shenanigans ensue, because it's an epic poem, and they eventually land on the shores of Latium, which is here. Now, despite what the story might suggest, Latium is not a kingdom, it is an area of the world, much like Greece was in this time, which was dominated by city-states. And Latium is, of course, the home of the Latins. And Aeneas goes and he founds his city there. Aeneas then has some children, and these children decide that they're going to go and leave and found their own city because they don't like Aeneas' city. It's too gay here. So they leave, they head a little further south, and they found their own city. And this city was called Alba Longa. And it was here that the story of Rome really begins, because a few generations on, because soon enough there was a succession crisis in Alba Longa, in which one son of the king killed the other son due to them being designated heir, and then attempted to kill all of their children in hopes of wiping out that bloodline and any possible challenges to their rule. Only one was spared, which was the brother's daughter. This brother's daughter was then basically the ancient equivalent of being sequestered in a monastery, which was designated a Vestal Virgin, which is a person who undergoes a vow of celibacy for the goddess Vesta. Just about all of this is passable history, but at this point, this is when the mythology really comes into it, which is, according to legend, Mars goes and finds this woman and has his way with her, leaving her pregnant with twins. When the twins are born, the usurper king of Alba Longa is furious, and he orders them to be cast out into the wilderness where they will die. However, the servant who was ordered to do this felt pity on them and put them in a basket and placed them in the Tiber River, where they floated downstream and hopefully would never be seen again. Later, further downstream, the two twins washed up on the shores of the Tiber, where they were found by a wolf. Now, this wolf, for, I guess, reasons unknown, decided that it was going to look after the two twins. So the legend goes is that for several years, the two young twins were raised by a wolf. Now, there has been some historic disagreement about this. There is speculation that the term wolf is actually a euphemism, and that in the original story, wolf is meant to mean prostitute. But later, as the story evolves, it's evident that people chose to interpret it a bit more literally. In a fairly ironic twist, turns out that the wolf is somewhat sexier than the prostitute, in a mythological sense. Years later, the twins are found by a shepherd, who takes them away from their wolf mother and raises them properly. These twins bore the name Romulus and Remus. When they grew up, at some point they got into a fight with some local thugs, who attempted to have them arrested. Romulus escaped, but Remus was captured, where he was brought to the court of his uncle, in Alba Longa. Romulus assembles a band of thugs of his own and goes to go and rescue him. And it's in this that he finds out about his birthright and that of Remus's, and he busts him out, and they go and they kill their treacherous uncle. So, although Romulus and Remus have now a claim to the city of Alba Longa, they decide that they want to found another city further south, down the Tiber, closer to where they grew up. So they go to the area near where they grew up, and they each find a place where they think it would be a great idea to start a settlement. Each of them chooses their own hill, which they want to start building on. It's at this point, though, that things start to come into question, because they are both twins, which means that each of them has equal claim to the throne of whatever city they would found. This quickly comes to blows, which results in Romulus killing Remus and starting the city on his chosen hill. He names the city after himself and calls it Roma. Romulus invites friends and acquaintances from his and anybody who's willing to come and start founding this new city. But a year or so on, and it's starting to be realised that Rome is a fucking sausage fest. Almost everyone who turned up to help settle it was a man. Very few women turned up to help found the city. And so it was decided that the Romans now had to procure wives for them all. And so a feast was set up, and basically a trap. They sent out invitations to various tribes all around them, the biggest of whom were the Sabines. When this festival was in full swing, Romulus hit a bell and the Romans sprang into action, grabbed the women of the Sabines and dragged them off behind the city walls. This started a war, of course, between the Romans and the Sabines, as the Sabines attempted to get their women back. This eventually resulted in a truce and a compromise deal, which essentially melded the two civilizations together. The Romans and the Sabines would become one tribe. In the legendary list of kings of Rome, about half of them were in fact Sabines. It was decided that they would basically take turns in who was going to rule the city, a Roman or a Sabine, in exchange for the Romans keeping all the women that they kidnapped. Right, now we get on to actual history. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Rome was located in a place called Latium, which is here. And as you can see, that's a fairly small area. That's because Italy in this time was absolutely far from united. It had a variety of different ethnic groups in it, which I will go ahead and put up right here. The most powerful group at this time were the Etruscans. And we know very little about the Etruscans because their language has still not been properly translated, but we do know that they did a number of practices which the Romans would later adopt, such as chariot racing, for example, big gladiatorial fights as well. The Etruscans also used a modified form of the Greek alphabet, which likely inspired the development of the Latin alphabet. The Romans were in constant contact with the Etruscans and they traded a lot, traded both physical commodities and ideas. But one important thing, one of the kings of Rome, one of the last ones, was an Etruscan. And so, when the Romans in 509 did a coup and threw out their monarchy in favour of a republic, this resulted in a massive war between them and most of the northern neighbouring Etruscan city-states. The Romans eventually won this and won the right to independence and republicanism. Over the course of the next couple of hundred years, the Romans would basically conquer all of Latium, bring all of the Latin-speaking peoples under the control of Rome. But it's at this point that a seminal event occurs in Rome's history, in the year 387. After allegedly breaking an agreement with a northern Etruscan city-state, Rome is seemingly inexplicably sacked by a Gallic tribe called the Senones. And this is an extremely brutal sack in which loads of people get killed, the wealth of the city gets carted away by the victorious Gauls, and historians also disagree on just what kind of an affair this was. Most of the older sources seem to suggest that this was a one-and-done thing, that the Gauls came in, tore shit up, and then fucked off north again. But more modern historians are suggesting that maybe the Gauls stayed and occupied the city for a few months before eventually leaving. Either way though, this traumatized early Rome. It shook it to its absolute core. And it's this that I would argue that sets Rome on the trajectory of world conquest. The Roman people realized that they are not safe as they were, so the only choice they have is to expand and to grow more powerful. And this results in them seriously modernizing and upgrading their military. You see, after the wars that were going on at this same sort of time, this is, I think, just a little bit before the Peloponnesian War, most places had essentially seen what the Greeks had done to the Persians and copied them. So most places fought in a style similar to the Greek phalanx. But the Romans decided that this was no longer adequate. You see, the phalanx had a number of big advantages and a number of big disadvantages. The main advantage being that it required very little training to actually pull off. All you had to do was get your shield and your spear and lock into a formation so that you covered both yourself and a little bit of the guy next to you. And then you would just sort of move together as a unit. And this makes them very, very hardy and very strong, but it makes them inflexible. It makes them difficult to coordinate because most of them are untrained. It makes them unmaneuverable, and it makes them likely to break up over uneven ground. Rome decided to do away with this entirely and start their own system, which is called the manipular system. And essentially what this comprised of was much smaller and much more heavily trained units called maniples. It also resulted in the significant upgrading of their equipment. So instead of having a shield which is designed to cover most of you and a little bit of the guy next to you, instead the Roman shields, the scutum, were designed to cover just the one single soldier that held them. That way they could split a unit and not deprive them of protection. Because with a phalanx, the bigger that it is, the more protection that it has. But with the Roman manipular system, you could break units off, give them different taskings, and because they were better trained, they could do this without losing their formation. They also replaced the long spears of the phalanx with a shorter sword. Now, why would they do this? What advantages does the shorter sword have over the longer spear? Because range is a pretty serious advantage at this time. Well, there was a variety of reasons. Part of it was cost, and I know that sounds strange given that a spear is almost certainly a lot cheaper than a sword, but a spear will also break a lot easier than a sword, whereas a sword, if properly maintained, can last for years. There's also the fact that it's a lot less unwieldy. A spear is very big and very long and difficult to store, and if you're going through, say, a wood, then it can absolutely cause a lot of trouble. It can get stuck on branches, it can knock into things, whereas a sword's not going to do that. And because Rome was adopting this new manipular system in which they were attempting to potentially break units up into smaller units in order to go into places where a phalanx might not be able to get into, such as a forest, this made total sense. And in addition, the lack of range wasn't too much of an issue because they would always be able to cover themselves with their scutum shields. The Romans also adopted a throwing spear called the pilum, which, not as long as an ordinary spear, this would normally be put on someone's back until used, and just before they engaged in melee combat, the Roman soldiers would take their pilum out and throw them, like a javelin, because that's what they were, into the enemy, which would potentially throw them off balance or force them to move their shield into a position to block the spear before the Romans would go in for a charge. This charge would then demolish the enemy while their shield was off fending off the javelin, at least so goes the theory. This would kickstart a massive expansion of the Roman territory, in which they would go to war with the Etruscans to the north and the Samnites to their south, and they would end up eventually conquering both of them. And almost 100 years after this all started, by the year 290, the Romans had managed to take over almost all of Italy, with the exception of the Greek south. This area is mostly inhabited by Greek city-states, usually colonies of other city-states from mainland Greece. And this caused a problem when Rome tried to take on a city called Tarentum, because Tarentum was an ally of Epirus, and when they came under attack from the Romans, they sent messages to Epirus for help. And Epirus sent an army led by their king, Pyrrhus of Epirus. The wars with Rome and Epirus would last for the next 10 years, and there was a very consistent trend with this, which was that Pyrrhus would turn up with his superior army, which actually contained 20 war elephants, fight an extremely close battle with the Romans that would end up with a victory for Epirus. But it would be such a costly victory for the Greeks that they would soon have to abandon this campaign. Epirus himself is quoted as saying, "If we have one more victory like that, we're done." So after years of campaigning against Rome, Pyrrhus returned to Epirus, where he went back to fighting against the Macedonians, and according to legend, at some point someone threw a brick at his head and killed him. And his legacy, apart from being killed by some yobbo throwing a brick, was that his name, Pyrrhus, was used in the future to refer to victories that are so costly that they may as well have been defeats, which is why we call it Pyrrhic victories. Right, I think that's a pretty good place to end off. At the end of this episode, the world looks like this. Rome has conquered most of the Italian peninsula, and the Hellenistic period of Greece is going on sort of somewhere over there. In the next episode, we're going to watch as Rome comes face to face with one of its most iconic enemies, the Phoenician colony of Carthage. This has been Graf. I will see you next time. Thank you very much.